Read it yet, so here is the book for you to see. It's Dutch Racism, edited by Philomena Essed and Isabel Hoving. And it's a wonderful collection and a timely collection. And some of you in this room, I'm sure, know Philomena's earlier work, Everyday Racism, which was an incredibly groundbreaking work for the Netherlands and got her into quite a lot of trouble, and she's been causing trouble ever since. So she is also, therefore, honorary member of the bus. Absolutely. But I wanted to ask her first to talk about why now this particular volume. The volume itself is very multifaceted. It has a title, Dutch Racism, which we might perceive to be narrow and geopolitically situated exactly within the nation-state boundaries, but instead it actually is is a roaming book. And is interested in the specificities of Dutch racism, but also as interconnected with other geopolitical spaces, and also as interlocking with racism, sexism, homophobia, and other isms, as well as a book that is, as the editor's remark in the introduction, multidisciplinary and multi-perspectival, has internal disagreements. It also has a range of different types of essays, from the personal to the more strictly academic, from the historical to the cultural, very much again in the spirit of the bus. And our journey together, where we've had poetry and academic lectures and drinking and other things, or sometimes all of them at once. But in that spirit, I wanted to ask you just to open up talking about both that structure of the book, but also why this period, especially as the book marks the period post 9/11/2001, as a particular time not only for the United States, but a time that marks something that is a real transition in the Netherlands, and then how this book really follows on that period and kind of situates itself in the changing nature of racism.
Thank you. You could do it for me. I mean, you are terrific. You know, you've read the book, I think.
On the bus.
It's like the little joke in the Netherlands when you would come from the former colonies and they had no idea about that Dutch was the enforced language, and they would say, "Where did you learn to speak Dutch?" And we'd say, "Well, on the plane." And they would say, "Whoa, that's really good." Why now? Let me first talk about the title, the Dutch Racism. Basically, what we wanted with more overt forms of racism going on in the Netherlands in the new millennium, we wanted that people would Google Dutch racism and that this book would come first, and that then they would see a framework for what we thought would be a nice critical approach to thinking about race and racism in the Netherlands. So that already says a little bit about why now, but let me tell you a little bit about the history of how this came about. I was on the train with Isabel Hoving, who is co-editor, and she is a member of the book series of the publisher, I think it's Race, Place and Sex or something like that. And she said, you know, we really need a new book about racism in the Netherlands, and would you want to edit that? And I thought, do I really want to do this? I mean, I have said what I wanted to say, I'm not going to repeat myself. And then I thought, well, actually, if I don't do it, who is going to do it? So we talked about it, and I decided to do it, but I said, I'm not going to do it on my own, because now I live in the US, even when I'm very often still in the Netherlands and still have some functions in the Netherlands. This has to be a book that is grounded in not only in the Dutch experience, which has been and still is my experience, but also in who are going to carry the struggle, who are going to be the activists, who are going to be accountable. I don't want to write something and then say, okay, ciao, if trouble happens, you know, you can reach me in California. I wanted people to take responsibility, but also I thought we wanted a book where there would be no ideological limitations, because the experience of most critical writers or authors in the Netherlands, the ones who were left, was that if you want to write about racism in the Netherlands, first it doesn't, if it's in a peer review and they ask somebody from the Netherlands, they're going to trash it. I've had, you know, some of that before, and the editors then would say, this is such a trashy review, something else is going on. We're going to ignore that peer review. So it has been very difficult for people. So we said, as long as it is a, you know, within what you expect as a scholar, and you know, well referenced and well thought, you can say whatever you've always wanted to say. So there is not going to be any ideological censorship. The only thing that we are not going to discuss is no articles about whether racism exists or not in the Netherlands. We can do that somewhere else. Yeah. So, given, you know, within that framework, we wanted to give the freedom for people to write what they always wanted to write. So why now? Actually, it is 30 years ago that I first published my first book on everyday racism in the Netherlands, which was written in Dutch. Yes, I'm an old lady, 30 years ago, but one can also say I started to write young. before my PhD, I had my first book. In the 1980s, there has been a the first book was in 1984, and that was the mid-80s was the highlight of Dutch anti-racism. It was a period where people could talk a little bit about it, and then immediately after 3 or 4 years, there was this incredible backlash. Which was symbolized by the closure of an incredible critical center at the University of Amsterdam called the Center for Race and Ethnic Studies, which was where we produced critical work. And the University of Amsterdam closed that center, and with that actually the access for students to read critical work about race and racism in the Netherlands was almost blocked. So you have a whole generation of people who grew up and went to the universities in the 90s until very recently, who would get, you know, incidentally access to something produced in the Netherlands, but basically if they wanted to know something, they had to take the route I had to take in the 1970s and 80s, like what are they doing in the US, what are they doing in the UK, because that was where the most information was. So it was also for me a political, if you will, decision to say, well, it's 30 years ago, I can't live with myself if I don't do something for the generation now in the Netherlands. Now we wanted the Dutch racism, like I said, we Google, whoops, there it is, our book. So that one is working, I think. The second thing is that we thought it shouldn't be only about what most books would do about the Netherlands. We wanted to have a point of view where you look at legacies of Dutch racism. It has been a colonial country. We know that too well over here. What happened on the Dutch soil in Europe? What happened in the colonies and in the former colonies? And what was the impact of what happened in the colonies and then back to the Netherlands? So we wanted to have everything included. So it is not a book that it does not compare, but it relates. It relates racism in the Netherlands to what happened in the colonies. For instance, one of my, all the articles are really great, and the themes are very well selected and chosen. But the first part, and there are some of my favorites, looked at the representation, for instance, of slavery in the Caribbean colonies from the point of view, not the quote-unquote master narrative, where they talk about slaves and not about enslaved, where they talk about the good masters, and that's part of the Dutch formal history. But where you would read about the slave system in the country of Suriname, South America, above Brazil, where from the point of view of what would it have been if you are a descendant from one of the slaves. So it's not that story, but it is that point of view, so that you could really look at policies and regulation and legal issues from the point of view, how would that have been experienced and impacted upon people who had been enslaved. So that's, for instance, one. Then there is another one, which was an eye-opener to me, about anti-Semitism. Now, I have to tell you, when I wrote my first book about everyday racism, the next day, newspaper on the line, you didn't talk about anti-Semitism. And then I said, well, there are some books about anti-Semitism in the Netherlands, and I really wanted to talk about people of color in the Netherlands. Yes, but next time you have to talk about anti-Semitism. It's this very sensitive thing about the relation with the Holocaust, and racism is only seen as, in relation to the Holocaust, and if you don't mention anti-Semitism, then you haven't talked about it. I saw great value of including a large chapter on anti-Semitism in this book, because it almost had some of the predictions of how the Dutch would react to those perceived as Muslims now. For instance, one of the things was that Jews had to be grateful that the Dutch had been so tolerant, and so don't complain about anything. And even, shocking to me, even after those who survived and came back after the Second World War were told, you should have been gassed. Literally, that had been, and there was resentment that they had caused. It was really ugly. Similar things you see happening with Muslims, that they have to be grateful. There is an enormous amount of Islamophobia, and I don't want to argue about terms, whether you call it Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism. Let's just call it Islamophobia at the moment. It is one of the highest forms of Islamophobia is what you're having in the Netherlands, and there you come with a 9/11 thing. That came a period where, and I think I included an article in your package if you have the time on a Sunday afternoon when you have nothing else to do to read it, where I talk about that how, to me, intolerable it became to hear all the time the most ugly things about the Islam and about Muslims. You could say, and still can say in the Netherlands, anything you fancy bad about the Netherlands. It's a nice slip. I like that. Anything bad. Anything bad about Islam, and you can get away with it. It's what I've called entitlement racism. That you can't say it, but you think, well, freedom of expression, and I can say whatever I want. So it's a long detour, huh? Okay, now you again.
I was just listening. Well, you've started to introduce a term, and I think actually it's a problem we've been discussing on the bus and in our journeys here, the problem of the US as a paradigm for understanding racism, or South Africa as a paradigm for understanding racism in the world. And part of, I think, what you try to do in the introduction is to establish a terrain for understanding racism inside of Dutch culture. And so you talk about the terms like regret racism, regret revenge is what I meant to say, regret revenge, entitlement racism. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about these terms, and one of the things in the article, which I know some of us have, intolerable humiliations, is that Philomena is talking about humiliation and about the Dutch version and understanding of themselves as tolerant, and there's a way of thinking about the Netherlands in tolerance, meaning as intolerant, and that everything is through this tolerance that the racism actually emerges inside of that. And so I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that very specific character of racism, which inhibits certain kinds of responses, because those who are the descendants of the slaves are supposed to be grateful for the life they have, for what the Netherlands has given them, and so the notion of tolerance is actually sometimes even turned against them. And any complaint about racism is treated as if they're the ones who are introducing race. We've been discussing this also on the bus many times. The idea that in the non-racial environment of South Africa, we've been discussing that those who are the ones who say, I am black and therefore this, are the ones who are often accused of being the racists. And you described something similar, but with a little bit of a difference in terms of Dutch racism.
I think in the Dutch case, I make a distinction between what I call the more paternalistic forms of racism, which is directed mostly at those who come from the colonies, and in which David would probably call racial historicism. You know, if you teach them well, they'll get there. They'll not be completely equal, but they'll get decent enough. But you'll never be real. So make them clones. I mean, I write about that in some of my other work. That is mostly the dominant attitude towards the colonies. In particular, the colonies where there are people of African descent, so in the Caribbean. It has changed with the Indonesians. It used to be the same, but now that Indonesia has become such a world power, the Dutch are basically cowards, because you lose money if you are too critical. So the attitude has changed. With the people who came from the migrant labor providing countries like Morocco and Turkey, and then refugees from many parts of the world, the attitude was always a bit different. There it was charity. We're so tolerant, we're going to give you a space in this country, and as long as you don't complain and if you don't claim anything, it's fine. But don't start to think that you have rights as well. Of course, I say it a little bit as in a caricature. Some people really think that, but don't say it out loud. But at one point they started saying this, like, why are you so ungrateful? Haleh Gorashi, she is one of the authors who writes about from the Iranian experience. She was a refugee from Iran. She writes about how indeed she came as a refugee and didn't write critical about the Netherlands. I could also understand that, and I would never tell a person what to write or not, because each one of us can, you can only define your own limits or your own agenda, and you cannot have somebody else say, well, good, be critical and protest. But I saw her change work with being grounding her feet in the Netherlands, where she didn't think that much anymore. I'm in your country, I take ownership now, is when she started to become more critical. And then people started to accuse her. We've taken you as a refugee. Why are you critical? Why don't you go back? You have no right to speak. So the ungrateful refugee, that is a theme that she writes about. So it's the resentment. We have been so good, and now we get this. Look at what we get. That attitude is quite strong. What I call entitlement racism relates to that. It used to be in the 1980s that people would say, I don't want to discriminate, but, and then they would say something racist. Now, you don't say that anymore. You just go straight for the racist statement. And then don't, and if you then say, well, that is racist, that's your problem, not mine. I can say whatever I want. It's my freedom to speech, freedom of expression. So that I have called entitlement racism. It's claiming the right to say whatever you want to say, and if it's then somebody would point out it's racism, you then go and problematize that person, or become very aggressive, as the stories about the Black Peter figure in relation to the Dutch Santa Claus. Some of you might have heard about it. This might
it just seems like fade away.
Is it fading? Yeah, no, it's okay. You see, I start talking about Black Peter. This is a conspiracy.
People a little.
People have been very, very, very aggressive in their response to those who objected. And all in the name of we can say whatever we want. So that's what I call entitlement racism. It's also a form of racism that wants to influence the public. So it's not what you say private. It's exactly what you say public, because you want to be heard, and that's freedom of expression, that you want to be heard. Otherwise, you don't express yourself, or otherwise, you say it on the toilet or whatever. But that's the freedom is when you want to be heard. So that form of racism I see as something new, having to do also very much with the neoliberalism, that you take ownership of what you say, and you are free, you have all the freedom in the world. Next question. This is not really working, is it?
You have to keep it kind of close.
More close? I've heard not to nothing. It seems to be very bad.
Let's see. You referenced something a moment ago when you were talking about some of your favorite articles from the beginning of the book, and I shared your assessment of those, and in particular, I wanted to talk a little bit about slavery, and ask you to talk with us about the master narrative, which you referenced there, and the article that talks about the fact that actually, even amongst Dutch scholars, that slavery was often written about from the standpoint of this as a business, in terms of loss and profits, etc., or from the standpoint of thinking about it from the slave owner's perspective, and that really that this has been a large part of the actual scholarly account of it, and so that really working against that is a part of this volume as well.
Yes. There is, I think, the article by Kwame Nimako, Abdu, and Glenn Williamson is one of the. Kwame Nimako has a book now also on that, which includes that topic. But it's a first example of a different approach to looking at slavery, and the established scholars would really, say ridiculous things like. You wouldn't be this far, or you wouldn't be here if not for slavery. And look at how far you have come. And not stating it this way, but including statements like that in their discussion of how bad was slavery really that bad, and and also talking about some of the good masters. So this is really a completely different approach.
I'm just thinking about other ways that the book sets up things that maybe are unexpected for us, even those of us who read a lot about these issues. And one piece which was interesting to me was the piece on the Indo-Europeans, which referred to the use of Indo-Europeanness as sometimes a brand, actually. And you spoke a moment ago about neoliberalism, and you also spoke about the special situation.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could talk about the relationship to Indo-Europeans within the matrix of racisms.
Yeah. Well, one thing that's an article by Essed, and she looks at. No, let me start differently. There is this myth in the Netherlands that, and it's part of the grand narrative, that the Indonesians integrated smoothly. You didn't hear a peep. No, you didn't hear much of a peep, because there was no way back for them. They had chosen the side of the Netherlands in the independence war of Indonesia, either because they were from the Netherlands or they were in mixed marriages with people from the Netherlands. So they took the wrong side. And so there was no way back for them. And if there is really no way back, you sort of adapt. But within, the privacy of their homes, they suffered from the denial of their culture, and from the enormous pressure for them to adapt. So she calls this the silent generation. And then you had the children from that generation, many of whom grew up in the 70s and 80s, some of them became part of the more critical tradition, or the critical group that I was part of as well, and started to talk about how their parents have suffered. Just a small side, one of the most moving things that happened to me when I published Dutch Racism in the Dutch language in 1984 was a woman who called me. She called me by phone. She said, I am 80 years old. I am of Indonesian background. She called herself Indo, that's the term. And I'm glad to live to see somebody finally write about discrimination in the Netherlands. And at that moment I thought, whatever will happen to me as a result of this, it was worth writing. For an 80-year woman who has suffered God knows how many decades, and nobody was talking about it. But in the meantime, global relations started to shift, and of course you saw Indonesia coming as an upcoming power in the, forcefully so with in the 90s, new millennium, and so it became a point of identification. Many people of Indo background, they don't have an Indonesian background because they fled the country when it struggled to become Indonesia. So, and they could say of an Indo-European background, they went back now to Indonesia for their vacations, and it became hip to be Asian, and so that's why they talk about the brand. What that article doesn't mention, and what I would have done if I would have written that article, is indeed the relation to Indonesia as a new power in the world. That part is not in it, and which is why I talk about it now. But that has made it a sort of a thing to be more proud of than they were told when they came to the Netherlands, that they were unhygienic, they were not that was what they heard. They were uncivilized, and they needed the Dutch to guide them through, the lessons of civilization.
It seemed.
Oh, I forgot. But there was, what this article starts with, and that was for me an eye-opener as well, was the resistance that was there in the so-called silent generation. And that was talking about the 40s and 50s. And it was small, but there was resistance, and there were critical authors, and that's what this article shares with us.
It also transitions for me to one of the central themes in your introduction, but also throughout the book, and that has to do with the role, the place of Islam, and the role of Muslims, and the form of racism against Muslims. And I'd actually like to ask you about that. I didn't really see this in the book. It's a question I actually brought to the book in a way, of how helpful the paradigms of racism we've had are to talk about Islamophobia, whether or not the question of secularism needs to be more directly addressed. And I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about the specific character of Dutch secularism. And for me in the book, I saw this connected also to the chapter on anti-Semitism, because it seemed like there was a real connection between the particular problem of anti-Semitism and the problem of Islamophobia, structured by a problem of tolerance on the one hand for cultural diversity, but the description of cultural diversity always having to exist within the same framework, so that every form of difference must be the same kind of form of difference, and that some forms of difference are not so easy to manage because they don't share certain kinds of frameworks. And of course, in the book, this comes out around Islam, especially because of the discussion of saving women, which is a theme in an international, transnational theme, but it's very much at the heart of what you're talking about in the introduction and also in several other chapters, that the Dutch position, the anti-Muslim position, is seen as preserving tolerance and also preserving women's rights. And so I wonder if you could just talk about the kind of nexus of questions around that specific scene.
That's a very, very complex issue indeed. Let me go back to where this Dutch thing with tolerance comes from. It comes from the fierce and bloody struggles between Catholics and Protestants. And the reason why it didn't end up, the Netherlands and didn't end up in an Ireland type of situation, is that they created this thing of tolerance, the pillar system, where you acknowledge different religions and you give each religion the same as a government. So if you have a Catholic school and you had a Protestant school, the Catholic school needs a new roof because it's leaking and it was going to be 5,000 guilders, then the Protestant school also gets 5,000 guilders to do something else with it. And this is not a joke.
This is what's called pillarization, right?
The pillarization system. So you have the pillars had to be equal. And although there was the Protestantism was dominant, the Netherlands is as a whole a Calvinistic country, even when you have Catholics. So so you see where the balance is. The system was it created a sort of acceptance of difference because the goodies were distributed equally, and within over time and over generations, the religions grew closer, and so now you have much more mixed schools and Catholic. It's not really an issue anymore. It's whether you're Christian or whether you're secular. And then of course you had, as from the 60s, this whole movement towards secularization and a retreat of basically the influence of the church. So now you have a group who comes to the Netherlands and they say, well, we're Muslims and religion is very important. So immediately people said, well, we done that. We done the pillarization, we done the thing now with the seculars, and now you come and you want to have a pillar again. We can't do that. And why don't you just keep quiet? Or why don't you do it privately? No, we have the right. We know we're in a democratic country, and if you have the right to have a church, we have the right to have a mosque. So it is in claiming the rights that were there in a democratic country that that the Dutch really didn't like. Then, of course, there was this huge generalization that every Muslim is the same, and with people like UCHRI saying that there is no such thing as moderate Islam. It's all extreme. And of course, you have people in all sizes and with all kinds of relations to religion. So that got in the mix. Then there was the idea that the myth that the Dutch woman was so liberated and that feminism, that emancipation was done, it was completed, that now you have a group that is still oppressed. They're dragging us down. And of course, sexism is all over the place in the Netherlands. It's different than it's similar and different than in other countries, but it had not been resolved. I mean, we are on the right path. It's going in a good direction, but it has not been resolved at all. But suddenly, the idea was the Dutch women don't have a problem anymore, but now the Muslims have a problem. Now, a very interesting thing occurred. If you compare the 1980s, the idea was that the Dutch were going to save the Muslim women from their oppressive husbands. That was the theme. That is not there anymore. It has now changed towards the Muslim women, and in particular the scarf, as the symbol of the threat for Dutch culture. So you have now aggression against Muslim women, especially if they are veiled. That sometimes they're called names, they're spit upon, and it's this does not happen, all the time. But there is a shift that now she has become from the paternalistic to the enemy. That's basically the shift that has taken place towards Muslim women. And in terms of men, I mean, you have the gender, racism is gendered, as we all know. Men who are perceived as having a Muslim background are criminalized, seen as terrorists. They have a very, very difficult time in the Netherlands. Very, very difficult, and in particular if they are of Moroccan background.
So this is not in the book, I don't think, unless I missed it. But now it reminds me to ask you about the Netherlands' general approach in the past to decarceration as a strategy, and how that has shifted with respect to what you just said, actually. This is an off-the-cuff question. I'd like to hear you comment on that a little bit.
I think two things are going on at the same time. There is still the tendency to want to be preventive rather than to punish. So there is the prison. They are constantly experimenting with. 2 weeks ago I read about another attempt not to put young people in prison, but to have them now live with families. And I was thinking, so who are these families going to be like? Are they going to be white Dutch family, or are they going to? That was my question. It was not in the newspaper. I couldn't ask anybody. But that was the latest thing that they were now thinking about, or actually experimenting with. There is another experiment that seemed to be successful, although it's on a small scale, where they have a house for young people who have come out of prison, where they have that was a how would you call him, a organizer or a coach of, I think, Moroccan background, who seemed to have a very good influence in having them. They could live there for a year and then get their act together, get housing, get a job, and they would get help. And then they had to move. So if you came on 1 January, 31st December, you got to go, whatever happens. But that seems to be positive as well. But in the meantime, you have still, if you are young, if you are Moroccan, chances that you are that you have been targeted by the police. You see, the dominant Dutch would say it differently. Chances that you have been in contact with the police, right? You give reason, and I say it differently. Chances that you have been targeted are 1 on 3 or 1 on 5. I mean, it's big.
So there's just a couple of things that are a bridge to where we sit right now that I'd love for us to talk about, given that we're in South Africa and we've been on the bus. And you mentioned very briefly Zwarte Piet, and I'm not sure everyone here knows about that and what's happening now. There's some recent legal challenges which I thought it might be nice for you to talk about. But also, I'm thinking about the article that you gave us also where you quoted our dear friend Ashila Mbembe, who's here, on the South African constitutional requirement or right to be respected.
Yeah.
And you contrast that to the situation in the Netherlands. And I wonder if from that you can maybe help us to learn a little bit about what's going on now in terms of that controversy.
The controversy of
Black Piet.
Okay, Zwarte Piet. South Africa has dignity in the constitution, right? The right to dignity, and it's one of, I think, 3 countries in the world who has that. I think Germany is another country. I think Canada is another country. There are not many countries who have that, and I was very happy to see that argument was used to ban this Mohammed cartoon, the Danish cartoons from being shown here. That was unthinkable in the Dutch government. You what? This is freedom of expression. We can say what we want. The same thing, not the same thing, a similar thing was happening with the Zwarte Piet figure. Is anybody not familiar with that figure? The Black Peter figure, who is a blackface figure, big lips, bushy hair, big earrings, a sort of Sambo figure who helps the Santa Claus, which is celebrated in the beginning of December. The other Santa Claus is another figure, but this is another figure. This is the Dutch figure, the Dutch Santa Claus, and who speaks quote-unquote broken Dutch, and who does silly things and amuses the children, and is basically a caricature of a black person. So ever since even before the 1980s, there has been protests every year. And an interesting thing has happened. I remember one of the first publications where there was a protest. It was called, I'll say it in Dutch and then I'll translate. Zwarte Piet is zwart verdriet. Black, you see it's rhyme. Zwarte Piet is black, is zwart verdriet. Black Peter is sadness for blacks. I mean, it doesn't rhyme in English. It doesn't make it, but in Dutch it made it. Interestingly, 30 years later, with a new generation, the slogan was not "It's Zwarte Piet is Zwarte Piet," but "Black Piet is racism." You zoom straight on what it is. The first person who started with that was could have been one of you in a program like this. He was part of the Black Europe Summer School, in which both David and I teach every summer, and it's basically providing a critical perspective of race and racism in Europe. And this has been the 7th or 8th year it was really great. I mean, really amazing. So many people there were this year, but it's providing a critical perspective. And there was this young man called Quincy Cairo, who was one of the students. He comes from the Dutch Antilles, in his 20s, and I will not say we made him critical, but he came with his critical mind, and he found fellow thinkers, and of course felt, also encouraged. Then something happened. His mother told him the story that I forgot the details, but whether it was her story or somebody else's, but it could have been her story. Something happened to her mother in relation to Zwarte Piet. I think she went to her job and she was a bit late, and her colleagues, it was around Santa Claus, December, said, "Oh, we're glad our Black Peter has arrived." And that shocked her. And she told this to her son, the experience, and he decided right then and there, this is the bloody limit, no more. And that encouraged him to, he's an artist, also a poet, to be very creative. So he made these T-shirts with Zwarte Piet is racisme, Black Peter is racism. And you could buy for €5, you could buy a T-shirt, and people were starting to wear it. Then in 2011, I think it was, he put on one of the T-shirts together with 2 or 3 other people in one of the Dutch cities where they had a arrival of the Santa Claus. I mean, it's this story that he arrives from Spain, and then the Black Peets come from Spain, and if you are naughty as a child, they're going to take you to Spain. And I mean, it's out of the world. I mean, it's people go on vacation in Spain. If I were a kid, I would say, "Yay, we're going to Spain again!" But I mean, this is a thing that is from the previous century when you didn't travel that much. So it's completely outdated, and the argument of adults is, "Oh, you're spoiling a children's party." Children are in for anything. If there are sweets, if there is presents, they take any story from you. And so it's not about spoiling anything of the children. If you say we don't want to have the Black Pete's figure, do your white Santa Claus thing on your own and leave blacks out of it. And no, because it's like a pet, and so they all love their Black people. Protests against this caused death threats, caused people being beaten. If you would look on Facebook, I don't look at these things. It's so ugly. But really, really ugly things, they would say to anybody who would engage in protests against white people. Really, very, very ugly. And when I say death threats, that's real. Over a tradition. So what he did is he continued throughout the year to have little protests, to take it out of the fall period when the Sinterklaas debate would happen. He pulled it over to January and February and March and continued to do things. And so more and more people were kind of joining this, and more people of color. Of course, there were the ones who said, don't be so sensitive, let them have this thing. And then there are, because not all Black people think the same. And of course, you're going to have difference of opinion. But he pulled it over with little actions that he would do and build a network. And so when he went to protest with his T-shirt, the police just beat him. And we are in the new century, so you have social media, so somebody takes it on their phone and throws it on YouTube, and it goes viral. So now you have people from outside of the Netherlands who started to write about it. What's going on there in the Netherlands? Article in, I think, the Washington Post, the New York Times, everywhere people were starting to talk, what's going on there in the Netherlands? So now the Netherlands were, you know, in particular on a political level, you're confronted with a problem. You got a problem there. So the Dutch way of doing things is to create a compromise. So they start with a group. I mean, there's nothing really bad about that, but it depends. If you're equal parties and you come to a compromise, you're equal in it. But if you're not equal parties, we don't know what's going to happen. So in particular, city of Amsterdam started with a group around what to do with the Zwarte Piet. Then, in the meantime, another, because you shouldn't have all the same strategy, another group, actually Quincy, together with others, filed a complaint with they went to court. But they didn't went to court, they didn't go to court against Zwarte Piet. What they said, the arrival of the Santa Claus with hundreds of Zwarte Piet is humiliating for black people. And Amsterdam is a diverse city and a lot of black people. And you do have, I mean, at that time of the year, you walk on the street, you have the right earrings. They're going to call you Black Peter and laugh. I mean, it's really, that happens. It really, that's how the racism happens. So they went to court, and lo and behold, the court, and I must say this was a woman judge, ruled in favor of the complaint the complaints that the Santa Claus arrival should take into account the privacy of black people as well, and they are violated in their privacy if they are exposed to these figures, and so the city of Amsterdam has to do something else. They got to come with a problem. And this is a huge, huge, huge thing. The problem isn't solved because now you're going to have people walk all over in their privacy as Black Peter, but at least at arrival. Now around in other cities they're starting to talk as well, because if it's ruled like this for Amsterdam, it's going to be ruled like this for other cities as well. So that has been a major victory. But you know, it's only the beginning of a lot more that needs to happen.
Okay, and just one final.
And there are 3 articles actually in the book about Zwarte Piet. That was actually more or less coincidence, because they look at it at 3 completely different ways, and that, I mean, if you combine them together, it's a very good read.
Yeah, I agree. So I'm just going to read a little bit of an article which was very fascinating to me, and given where we are, about the relationship between the Dutch and Afrikaners and Afrikaner history. And I'm sorry, I will mispronounce the name here, but the passage is, when the singer, Op van Blerk, is that how do you pronounce the name? Yeah. Recorded a song in 2006 about General de la Rey, the Afrikaner hero of the Anglo-South African War. It became the most successful South African debut album ever, spreading like wildfire, and achieving something of the status of an Afrikaner anthem. Replete with iconography invoking Afrikaner history and suffused with suffering, the song promises that the Boer are a nation that will rise again. Reactions to this phenomenon have been diverse, ranging from those who see the song as an attempt to recuperate the history of the Afrikaners to find a place of self-respect, to those who see the song as a virtual incitement to treason. Afrikaans radio stations in neighboring Namibia banned the song for fear of importing the political controversy. And I wanted to end with this, and also thinking about this often unremarked relationship between the Netherlands and South Africa in this respect, in the cultural respect. And a lot of this article is actually on the deep history here, and the particular way in which the multicultural European context of whites in South Africa is made Dutch, and how it's made Dutch, and also about the contemporary impact of that. And so I wondered if you could just close with some remarks about that and the connection to what's happening here.
Actually, the article is by Melissa Stein, probably known to you as well. And it's an example of how we conceptualize the book. Because apartheid is a legacy of Dutch racism, even when it took its own form here. And when the Dutch would refer to apartheid, it was like, oh, what they're overdoing there has nothing to do with us. And with this article, we bring the link back to the fact that apartheid is the only Dutch word that has gone global. So it's a very Dutch. Has very Dutch roots. With the South African situation has always served for the Netherlands as the bad example, and of course it was a bad example, but not like you have nothing to do with it. So it was racism is there and it's never in the Netherlands. So it has always functioned like that. What the Netherlands was very much involved in the struggle against apartheid in symbolic forms, but also in boycotts. But it was against apartheid, not against racism. So apartheid was not seen as a form of racism. It was seen as I don't know what, as apartheid, but not. You see, the link was not being made. So now with the demise of, at least the formal demise of apartheid in South Africa, that has gone. You can't point at South Africa and saying it's there. So the time has come now, and I can refer also to many reports now from the UN, from the European Commission, pointing to racism in the Netherlands, that for the first time in history, last week, two things happened. You had the ruling of the court, and you had representatives of the Dutch admitting that there is racism in the Netherlands. And that without saying, well, it's those extreme groups, but they're saying we have a problem in the Netherlands. So that is something very historical what is happening. There's going to be backlash. I think what we can learn as people in the Netherlands, in particular in struggle, that you need generations to. I mean, transition is not overnight. That you have generations of struggle, generations of sacrifice that is needed in order to achieve your goal. It's not a quick fix. At the same time, I think what I don't really know, but what I hope is not the case, that one would take a position that once you have your legal rights, or once you are post-apartheid, that one does not see the link anymore with the past. Because if you do not continue to see that link, you don't remember how bad it can be. And if it's not like a situation can go back completely, but human beings are human beings. And there has been violence, and there has been exploitation and oppression throughout history. And if you don't know your history, you don't know what your people are capable of doing in the worst ways, but of course also in the very good ways. And the struggle in South Africa has inspired us around the world. And the country continues to inspire. I mean, one of my most amazing experiences was in 2011, when I happened to witness the graduation of hundreds of students at the University of Pretoria. And it was just amazing. I was thinking, wow, 15 years ago, this would not have happened. And I was deeply moved to see so many, and the majority, many were black women to graduate. That was really moving, and I think, wow, what you have achieved in, within one generation is just mind-boggling.